Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about Sophocles' play Oedipus at Colonists. So this is the second play of the so-called Theban cycle, which I've done a video on before. I talked a little bit about this in my previous video on Oedipus the King, but the three plays of the Theban cycle are not a proper trilogy in the way that something like Aeschylus' Oresteia is. Oedipus at Colonists was written decades after Oedipus the King, which was itself written about a decade and a half after Antigone. So we've got massive amounts of time between when these three plays were written, which partially explains some of the inconsistencies between them. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those inconsistencies today. So Oedipus at Colonists is often regarded as an old man's play, and it really is. I mean, this is possibly the last play that Sophocles writes. He was probably over 90 when he wrote it, and he'd written over 120 plays by the time he gets to Oedipus at Colonists. It has something of the feel of King Lear for me, of Shakespeare's King Lear, because there so much of Oedipus at Colonists is focused on this experience of exile and betrayal by one's children, and the true children versus the betraying children and things like this. I mean, we could almost hear Oedipus saying King Lear's famous line, "How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child." This is also a play where Oedipus is supposed to be reformed. Oedipus is supposed to be transfigured, and he's become a sort of object of veneration. That's the sort of traditional reading of this. And this is, I mean, Paul Roche in the Signet Classics translation, and as I've said before, I like Roche as a translator. He gives us that sort of indication in his critical introduction. For him, Oedipus is transfigured into a holy being. And this is partially true, but I actually don't think it's as true as Roche sort of makes it out to be. So the problem for me is that I'm not really convinced Oedipus changes in substantive ways. So I'll give you first a very brief plot summary of Oedipus at Colonists, and then I'll sort of talk through that more. So basically what happens is that Oedipus is now old. He's been wandering for 20-25 years or so after having blinded himself and self-exiled from Thebes at the end of Oedipus the King. And he arrives at Colonus, which is a sort of suburb, what the Greeks call a deme. It's a suburb of Athens, and it has a holy grove sacred to the Eumenides, who are divine protectors of Athens. Oedipus recognizes that this is where he's fated to die, and he knows that possession of his dead body is going to bring whoever has it great blessings. So he sends for the king of Athens, Theseus. Theseus shows up, and basically Oedipus is like, hey, let me live out my last couple of days here, and then I will bestow great blessings upon you and your city. Theseus says, that sounds great. But the Thebans try to come and get Oedipus because they also know of the prophecy that whoever has Oedipus will have great blessings bestowed on them. So first Creon comes and basically tries to kidnap Oedipus, When that doesn't work, he has his soldiers kidnap Antigone and Ismene, who are there basically making Oedipus's life functional as a blind beggar wandering the streets of Greece. When that doesn't really work, Creon once again attempts to kidnap Oedipus before he's driven off by Theseus. Then Polynices shows up, one of Oedipus's sons/brothers, the one who has been exiled from Thebes and is now raising an army in Argos to go back and take the throne of Thebes from his brother Eteocles. So Polynices shows up and basically tries to play the "hey, we're both exiled from Thebes" card, and tries to get Oedipus to go with him so that his invasion of Thebes will be successful. Oedipus is having none of this because when Polynices was king of Thebes, he refused to let Oedipus back into the city. And so Oedipus curses both Eteocles and Polynices, condemning them to destroy one another, and basically, the whole 7 against Thebes thing, which we get in a number of other plays, including by Aeschylus. So, and that's actually the action that prompts Sophocles' Antigone as well. So that's basically what Oedipus at Colonus is about. Oh, and then Oedipus goes off into the grove and dies, and his final resting place is forbidden for anyone but Theseus and his heirs to know. So, that's basically the end of it. I'm not really sold on the narrative that Oedipus has substantially changed in this play. So we've got a couple of different things here. One is that we have a reversal of the sort of narrative arc of fortune. Because in Oedipus the King, Oedipus starts out not necessarily as a semi-divine being, but he starts highly reverenced. He's a successful, well-respected king, and by the end he is a dishonored, hated beggar out in exiled from his homeland. At the beginning of Oedipus at Colonus, he starts out as a disgraced, hated beggar, and actually the residents of Colonus try and get him to leave. They try and throw him out because of who he is at the beginning of the play. But by the end of the play, he becomes this object of veneration. So, while on the one hand we have a sort of downward arc from success to tragedy, from success to destitution, and on the other hand we have an arc from destitution up to success, this is a change of kind. This is a change of emphasis rather than kind. It's not a different type of story, it's simply a reversal or a correction of the previous story. But then the other thing is, Oedipus says a couple of times that he's moderated his position since he blinded himself and permanently exiled himself from Thebes. And this is an interesting point because in Oedipus the King, he's punished for his hubris. He's punished for his overweening pride. But in Oedipus at Colonus, he has a different kind of overweening pride. So he does say that after having been exiled for a while, he kind of changed his mind. It was like, well, I'd like to go back to Thebes now, even though I said I should never be allowed to return, etc., etc. And he blames Creon and Eteocles and Polynices for not being like, well, okay, you changed your mind, you can come back even though you brought a horrible plague to our city because you killed your father and married your mother. No harm, no foul. like, it's not necessarily a reasonable expectation for them to just be like, yeah, gates are open, come on in, Oedipus. But he blames them for this, and the hubristic component is that he blames them in such a way that his primary reaction to them is to curse them for eternity for not letting him return to the city, even though he's a source of pollution for the city. So he actually he explains this grievance several times, specifically in response to Eteocles and Polynices. He says, "I was their father, thrust out from fatherland in full disgrace. They did not rescue or defend me. No, they cared nothing, but watched me harried from my home, my banishment proclaimed. And if you say that such was then my wish, a mercy granted by the city, apt and opportune, I answer no. On the first day I wished it, yes. Death was sweet, my soul on fire, even death by stoning. But no man was found to further that desire. In time my madness mellowed. I began to think my rage had plunged too far, my chastisement excessive for my sins. And then the city, mark you, after all that time, had me thrust and hurtled out of Thebes. Then they could have helped, my two boys, their father's sons. Then they could have stirred themselves, they could. They did not do a thing. For lack of a little word from them, I was cast out to drag away my life in wandering beggary. Shelter, devoted care, my daily bread, everything within a woman's power to give, these I owe to my two daughters here. Their brothers sold their father for a throne, exchanged him for a scepter and a realm." So, and again, like when Polynices shows up, Oedipus has this terrible curse that basically he condemns both brothers to die at one another's hands. This, to me, is a continuation of Oedipus's hubris from Oedipus the King. It's also the sort of King Lear thing of like, in King Lear, I've renounced my throne, but I want to keep being king. In Oedipus at Colonus, it's, yes, I was a source of pollution that brought a plague to Thebes, and I said I should be exiled forever, but then I changed my mind, and everyone should have gone along with me. And because they didn't go along with me, they're going to be damned forever, even though I also know that my fate is to die in this sacred grove at Athens after wandering for decades. So that's the sort of third component of this, for me, of Oedipus's failure to change, is that he plays the I was fated to kill my father and marry my mother, and so you can't really blame me for that card. But he doesn't follow through with the logic of that, which is that if he's also fated to wander for the rest of his life until he gets to Colonus, where he's fated to die, then nobody at Thebes could have let him come back to Thebes. Like, that would have been their fate. Fate doesn't just work when it's convenient for letting you off the hook for literally causing a plague in your city. Like, if this is fate, if Oedipus's life is guided by fate, then he can't blame anyone else for doing the things that they had to do according to fate. If he wants to also say, no one can blame me. But he doesn't. He blames Creon, he blames Eteocles, and he blames Polynices for doing the things that they were as fated to do as he was when he beat his father to death, or whatever it is, at that crossroads, and when he married Jocasta upon returning to Thebes. Like, you don't get to have it both ways. If it's fate for you, then it's fate for everyone else as well. So that's the problems I have with Oedipus in this play. There's a couple of other things I do want to talk about, just very briefly. One is the foreshadowing of events to come. And again, this is a very common thing in Greek tragedy, but we've got the setup here for a couple of other plays, or other parts of the myth cycle. I mean, these would have been explored in a number of different plays, but a couple of plays that we have that survive. So when Polynices comes and he's explaining his plan, it's a weird explanation of his plan too, by the way, because I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's a bit lengthy, but basically he comes and he's like, yeah, I'm going to gather up all these great warriors and go destroy Thebes. Want to come help? Oedipus, who loves Thebes? I know you think it's a great city, but let's go destroy it. Like, it's a weird pitch. It's not a pitch really calculated to work, but he sets this up, and he actually goes through and he says, all my allies who at this moment raise the standard of their 7 spears, and ring their 7 armies round the plain of Thebes. There's Amphiaraus, the hurricane spearman, first at the spear, first at the reading of riddles. Then the son of Onius, Tydeus of Aetolia. Third comes Eteoclus, native of Argos. Fourth, Hippomedon, sent by his father Tullius. Fifthly, Capaneus, swearing to mow down Thebes with fire. Again, certainly the phrasing you want to use when trying to get Oedipus on your side. Sixthly, Parthenopeos, born in Arcadia, son of Atalanta, the ferocious virgin who finally wedded and became the mother of this stalwart boy. And lastly, I, your son, etc., etc. So, this idea of the 7 champions is central to the 7 against Thebes myth. We get that of the surviving Greek tragedy we have most explicitly in the 7 against Thebes by Aeschylus. But then the other bit that we've got that's foreshadowing another play that survives, after Oedipus turns Polynices away and curses him and his brother, Polynices says to Antigone and Ismene, "But you, his little ones, my sisters, now you've heard our father's prayers, his prayers of hate, please, if ever they should come to bear their mortal fruit, and you be found in Thebes again, then by all the gods on that blessed chance I beg, do not let my shade be damned, but put me in the tomb with hallowed rites, so shall you earn more praises from me dead than from that living father for all you did." So this sets us up for Antigone, which is, of course, the third play of the traditional Theban cycle, because the entire conflict of Antigone is about whether or not Polynices' body should be buried. And Antigone comes out very strongly on the side of burying it. So we have that element here. The last thing I want to very briefly talk about is the weirdness of the timeline of these 3 plays. Because, and this is most expressed with Antigone herself, because in Oedipus the King, the earliest of the myth cycle, she's a small child. It's not clear how young she is, but she's old enough to walk, she's old enough to sort of have some degree of awareness of what's going on as Oedipus exiles himself. So maybe call it 4 or 5 at the youngest. Then at Oedipus at Colonus, he's been wandering 20-25 years or so. And Antigone has been with him most of that time. So if we put it at the low end of that estimate, and he's been wandering for about 20 years, she's in her mid-20s. One of the things to remember is that in the ancient world, life tended to be much shorter than it does today. So when Antigone says, "Father, listen to me, young though I am," if she's in her mid-20s into her early 30s, she's not that young by Greek standards. She's a fully adult human being. And then if we go to Antigone, the events of Antigone they have to be several years after Oedipus at Colonus. Antigone's gotta be late 20s at the very earliest, if not in her 30s. And that's extremely old for an ancient Greek woman to be marrying. So, but she's always presented in Antigone as this young, defiant woman. She's not. She's an adult, if this timeline makes sense. But this is actually one of the fascinating things about myth, is that the timeline doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to make sense. She can be in her mid to late 20s in Oedipus at Colonus and still be 18 or 20 in Antigone, because it's myth and it doesn't follow logically. There's not an actual chronology here that we could follow to figure out what age people should be. So that's one of the really interesting things about the myth cycles, and particularly this one, the Theban cycle of Oedipus the King, Oedipus at Colonus, and Antigone. Because they were written decades apart, you have those inconsistencies really obviously highlighted.